The hangar erupted in laughter when she walked in with her toolbox. Lieutenant Parker smirked to his wingman about the girl who thought she could fix a $40 million jet. Sarah Martinez didn't even look up from her checklist. She'd heard it all before. But what these cocky F-35 pilots didn't know was that she had flown this exact aircraft in classified missions they'd never even heard of. Welcome to the human stories. Before we dive into this powerful journey, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video and what time is it right now. The morning sun at Ramstein Air Force Base cut through the hangar's steel framework like silver knives, casting sharp shadows across the concrete floor where million-dollar war machines waited in perfect formation. The air smelled of jet fuel and hot metal. Sarah Martinez moved between these sleeping predators with the fluid grace of someone who understood every system that kept these aircraft airborne and lethal. Her coveralls were Navy regulation blue, clean but patched at the knees and elbows where real work left its mark. Her hands bore the honest stains of engine oil, calluses mapping years of expertise that went far beyond routine maintenance. Dark hair pulled back in a practical knot revealed the faint white scar running along her left temple, a memento from an incident involving shrapnel and a Syrian mountainside that existed in no official record. At 32, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to hide extraordinary competence behind ordinary appearances. To the base personnel at Ramstein, she was just another civilian contractor, another technician who showed up before dawn and disappeared after the pilots went home to their families and their carefully edited war stories. They saw grease-stained fingers and assumed limitation. They watched her work in methodical silence and concluded she had nothing important to contribute. They were catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Parker embodied everything Sarah had learned to navigate during her 3 years of enforced anonymity at Ramstein. 26 years old, fresh from advanced flight training, blessed with reflexes that tested perfectly, and cursed with an ego that made experienced officers cringe during briefings. He moved through the hangar like he owned not just the building, but the entire concept of military aviation. His voice, perpetually calibrated to ensure everyone within 50 feet heard his authoritative opinions about aircraft maintenance, mission planning, and especially about female contractors who dared to touch his precious Lightning II. Parker's wingman, Lieutenant Morrison, fed off the same concentrated arrogance that infused their entire squadron. Together, they formed the kind of pilot duo that made 20-year veterans shake their heads and mutter about the good old days, when cocky meant you'd survived something worth being cocky about. These two built their swagger on 6 months of peacetime flying and zero understanding of what their aircraft could actually do when pushed beyond the safety parameters of training exercises. Sarah tuned out their running commentary as she connected her laptop to Parker's F-35, her fingers moving across the keyboard with unconscious precision. And today, something was very wrong. The problem was subtle enough to escape routine inspection. Most mechanics would have signed off on the aircraft without a second thought, but Sarah recognized the pattern from her previous life. This wasn't ordinary wear and tear. This was the unmistakable sign of imminent catastrophic failure. If this aircraft experienced high stress, the engine would fail completely. In other words, Lieutenant Parker was about to take off in a $40 million death trap. Sarah's carefully constructed background was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction designed to protect both her real identity and the classified programs she had once been an integral part of. Her personnel file listed her as a civilian contractor with extensive experience in aircraft maintenance systems, hired through a defense firm with appropriate security clearances. The documentation was flawless, the references impeccable, and every detail designed to deflect curiosity rather than invite investigation. The truth was exponentially more complex and infinitely more dangerous. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago, Sarah Martinez had been Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, call sign Ghost Rider, one of 12 test pilots cleared for participation in Project Aurora, a black-budget program developing next-generation stealth fighters so advanced that their existence violated several international arms treaties. These weren't the F-35s that regular Air Force pilots flew in carefully choreographed exercises. These were aircraft that didn't officially exist, built with technology that wouldn't appear in mainstream military systems for another decade. Sarah hadn't just test-flown these experimental machines, she had helped design them. During her 5 years with Project Aurora, she had worked directly with engineers to improve flight systems, weapons integration, and stealth capabilities that could only be properly evaluated by someone who understood both the theoretical limits of the technology and the practical constraints of human endurance at extreme speeds. Her specialty had been extreme testing, flying prototype aircraft under conditions that would destroy conventional fighters and kill ordinary pilots. She had pushed experimental engines past their limits, tested stealth coatings under combat stress conditions, and evaluated weapon systems that existed only in the fevered imaginations of defense contractors with unlimited budgets and minimal oversight. But during a mission over Eastern European airspace that officially never happened, Sarah's cover identity had been compromised. Enemy intelligence services had gotten dangerously close to identifying Ghost Rider's real name, which would have exposed not just her, but the entire Project Aurora program to international scrutiny. The response had been immediate, absolute, and irreversible. Within 72 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen had been declared killed in action during a training accident, her body reportedly vaporized in a high-altitude explosion that left no recoverable remains. Ghost Rider had been retired from active status and all associated records sealed under presidential classification. Sarah Martinez, civilian aircraft technician, had emerged from the bureaucratic ashes with a perfectly documented history and no connection to the woman who had once flown aircraft that challenged the laws of physics. The protection program had given her safety, anonymity, and the crushing burden of watching other people make potentially fatal mistakes while being unable to use her expertise to prevent disaster. For 3 years, she had been forced to observe in silence as pilots who knew a fraction of what she did about these aircraft made decisions based on incomplete understanding of their capabilities and limitations. Now, she stood in a Ramstein hangar, staring at data that predicted Lieutenant Parker's death with mathematical precision, and her carefully maintained cover identity prevented her from taking any action that might save his life. Sarah approached Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the only person on base who seemed to suspect that her background contained more complexity than her personnel file suggested. Williams had accumulated 20 years of experience reading people, evaluating competence, and recognizing when someone's expertise exceeded their official qualifications. Something about Sarah's technical knowledge, her procedures, and her unconscious familiarity with classified aircraft systems triggered his professional instincts in ways he couldn't quite articulate. She showed him the laptop screen without explanation, pointing to the specific data that revealed the impending engine failure. Williams studied the readouts with the focused attention of someone who had learned to spot trouble before it became catastrophic. His experienced eyes caught details that would escape casual observation, the patterns that indicated this wasn't routine maintenance data, but a warning of imminent mechanical disaster. The two exchanged a meaningful look that conveyed more information than most conversations. Williams understood that Sarah possessed knowledge that extended far beyond civilian contractor credentials. Sarah recognized that Williams had the professional wisdom to accept expertise, regardless of its source. But across the hangar, Parker and Morrison were completing their pre-flight briefing with the confident enthusiasm of pilots who had never experienced real emergency conditions. Helmets tucked under their arms, flight suits pristine, attitudes radiating the invincible certainty that came from successful training exercises and zero exposure to actual combat stress. They would not listen to warnings from a female contractor about potential aircraft problems. Their egos, their training, and their institutional prejudices created an impenetrable barrier to accepting technical advice from someone they considered beneath their professional consideration. Sarah knew that attempting to ground Parker's aircraft based on her analysis would accomplish nothing except possibly exposing her real background to unwanted scrutiny. So she returned to her workstation, opened her laptop to monitor real-time data from Parker's F-35, and prepared to watch two pilots die because military hierarchy was more important than mechanical reality. 15 minutes later, Parker's Lightning II rolled down the taxiway with Morrison's aircraft maintaining perfect formation behind him. The morning sun reflected off their canopies as they accelerated down Ramstein's main runway, afterburners painting brilliant orange flames against the German sky. Sarah tracked their progress on her screen, watching engine parameters that remained within normal ranges during the low-stress conditions of takeoff and initial climb. The real-time data showed the engine was failing exactly as she had predicted. Sarah could watch the countdown to disaster playing out on her laptop screen. 18 minutes and 37 seconds after takeoff, the inevitable happened. The emergency transmission crackled through every radio in the hangar with the desperate urgency of a pilot experiencing his first real brush with mortality. Parker's voice carried panic barely controlled by training as he reported complete engine failure and requested immediate emergency assistance. The professional composure that had characterized his pre-flight swagger evaporated in the face of a $40 million aircraft that was no longer responding to his commands. The hangar transformed instantly from routine morning operations to controlled chaos. Personnel rushed to emergency stations with practiced efficiency, while radios crackled with coordination chatter between the control tower, rescue services, and senior officers converging from across the base. Red lights activated throughout the facility as Ramstein's emergency response protocols engaged automatically. Sarah remained motionless at her workstation, laptop screen showing real-time data from Parker's failing aircraft. She had been expecting this exact moment for the past 18 minutes, watching the engine parameters degrade according to patterns she recognized from classified testing programs. The failure was proceeding exactly as her analysis had predicted. Base Commander Colonel Richards burst through the hangar doors with the urgent intensity of a career officer who understood that aircraft emergencies could become international incidents within minutes. His sharp eyes immediately identified Williams as the senior enlisted person present and demanded an immediate situation report that would help him coordinate rescue efforts and damage control. Williams quickly summarized the engine failure while pointing towards Sarah, who continued monitoring Parker's aircraft systems with unnatural calm despite the emergency developing around her. He explained that the contractor had predicted this specific failure earlier that morning based on analysis that exceeded standard maintenance procedures. Colonel Richards turned towards Sarah with the focused attention of someone trained to identify critical resources during crisis situations. His 23 years of military experience had taught him to recognize competence regardless of rank or official position, and something about this contractor's composed response to a life-threatening emergency triggered his professional instincts. Sarah could see Parker's aircraft status deteriorating rapidly. The engine was failing, systems were shutting down, and flight controls were becoming unresponsive. Parker had perhaps 4 minutes before his aircraft became completely uncontrollable. Colonel Richards asked directly if she could provide technical assistance to save the pilot's life. Sarah looked at the data streams showing an aircraft in rapid mechanical decline and realized that preserving her cover identity was less important than preventing Parker from dying in a fireball of twisted metal and aviation fuel. She accepted the radio handset and transmitted on the emergency frequency with the calm authority of someone who had talked pilots through impossible situations before. Parker's desperate response revealed a young man discovering that all his training simulations had failed to prepare him for the reality of an aircraft determined to kill him. Sarah began talking him through emergency procedures. She directed him to reduce power without shutting down completely. Her instructions were delivered with the confidence of someone who had done this before. Parker's aircraft responded exactly as she predicted. Sarah continued guiding Parker through the emergency. She directed him to switch to backup controls and warned him not to restart the main systems. Around the hangar, personnel watched in amazement as this contractor demonstrated expertise that exceeded anything in their experience. Air traffic control attempted to intervene with standard emergency procedures, but Colonel Richards recognized that Sarah's guidance was producing results that couldn't be achieved through conventional approaches. Something in her technical knowledge, her calm confidence, and her obvious familiarity with F-35 systems under extreme stress conditions told him that this contractor possessed capabilities that weren't documented in any personnel file. Sarah talked Parker through the emergency approach with detailed precision. Her guidance revealed knowledge that no civilian contractor should possess. The emergency coordination continued as Sarah guided Parker through procedures that required both technical knowledge and understanding of human behavior under stress. The F-35 approached Ramstein's emergency runway at precisely the speed and angle Sarah had calculated, touching down with barely controlled violence but remaining intact as it rolled toward the foam trucks already positioned for crash response. Parker's final transmission carried the shaken gratitude of someone who had just experienced a miracle disguised as technical expertise. As emergency crews swarmed the damaged aircraft and Parker climbed shakily from his cockpit, the entire base seemed to pause in recognition that something extraordinary had just occurred. Word spread rapidly through hangars and operations buildings that the quiet contractor everyone had ignored possessed capabilities that had just prevented a catastrophic loss of both aircraft and pilot. Colonel Richards approached Sarah as she powered down her diagnostic equipment, his expression mixing professional respect with barely contained curiosity about how a civilian contractor had just executed an emergency landing coordination that exceeded anything in his 23 years of experience. In the privacy of his office, Richards accessed Sarah's personnel file through the base computer system, discovering that most of her background information was obscured by classification markings that indicated security clearances far above civilian contractor levels. Black bars covered previous assignments, technical qualifications, and clearance levels in patterns that suggested involvement with programs requiring presidential approval. Richards recognized the bureaucratic signatures of black program documentation, the careful balance between providing sufficient information to justify employment while concealing details that could compromise national security. This contractor's background had been sanitized by professionals who understood how to hide extraordinary capabilities behind mundane job descriptions. Sarah chose her responses carefully, providing just enough information to satisfy immediate curiosity while avoiding details that might compromise ongoing classification requirements. She acknowledged previous involvement with aircraft testing programs without specifying the nature of those programs or the classification levels that had governed her participation. Colonel Richards made an immediate decision that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics at Ramstein Air Force Base. Based on demonstrated competence rather than documented credentials, he promoted Sarah to senior technical advisor for all F-35 operations and granted her authority to override standard maintenance procedures when technical analysis indicated potential safety concerns. When Sarah returned to the hangar, the transformation in atmosphere was immediately apparent. Mechanics who had previously ignored her now sought her technical opinions. Pilots who had dismissed her as inconsequential now nodded respectfully when she passed. The institutional hierarchy that had rendered her invisible now elevated her to a position where her expertise could be properly utilized. Parker himself waited by her workstation with the humbled demeanor of someone who had just learned the difference between training confidence and actual competence. The arrogant young pilot who had mocked her that morning now stood with the respectful attention of someone who owed his life to capabilities he was only beginning to understand. Sarah acknowledged his gratitude with professional courtesy, but offered no explanation of how she had acquired the knowledge that saved his life. She had learned through bitter experience that mystery was more powerful than revelation, that unanswered questions often provided better protection than detailed explanations. That evening, alone in her carefully anonymous apartment, Sarah opened a secure storage case that contained the only physical evidence of her previous existence. Inside lay a single photograph showing a woman in an experimental flight suit, standing beside an aircraft that didn't appear in any public documentation. The woman wore a mission patch bearing the call sign Ghost Rider and classification markings that remained active despite the program's official termination. Sarah's secure phone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for communications that bypassed normal channels. The voice that identified itself using her old call sign carried the authority of someone with clearance levels that existed above congressional oversight. 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity were about to end. The protection program that had kept her safe by making her invisible was being terminated by circumstances that required her specific expertise to be brought back into active service. Ghost Rider was being reactivated. Sarah stared at the photograph, then out her window at the Ramstein flight line, where F-35s sat under security lights like technological predators waiting for dawn. Tomorrow, she would return to the hangar as the newly promoted senior technical advisor, but tonight she prepared for the possibility that Sarah Martinez might disappear as completely as Ghost Rider once had. The most dangerous secrets aren't the ones that get revealed. They're the ones that get reactivated after years of dormancy. And at Ramstein Air Force Base, everyone was about to discover that their anonymous contractor had been hiding capabilities that could reshape their understanding of what was possible in modern aerial warfare. The protection program had given her 3 years of safety, purchased with anonymity and the frustration of watching preventable mistakes from the sidelines. But legends don't retire permanently. They just wait for circumstances that require their particular combination of knowledge and capability. Sarah Martinez would continue her cover identity as long as operational security required, but Ghost Rider was ready to fly again. If you stayed until the end, tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked or what job you did? Sarah's story reminds us that the most extraordinary people often hide in plain sight, and true strength doesn't need to announce itself. Subscribe to the Human Stories channel for more tales of courage, redemption, and the remarkable people walking among us. Thank you for being here. And remember, legends don't retire. They just wait for the right moment to remind the world why they became legends in the first place.